In the mid-16th century, the small German duchy of Saxony was ruled by King Ulric II, a monarch remembered not for conquest or reform, but for control through fear. His reign coincided with the height of Europe's religious upheaval, where blasphemy, heresy, and dissent were seen not as crimes of conscience, but as threats to order. Ulric's rule began after years of civil strife that had weakened the authority of the crown. Determined to restore obedience, he enforced strict laws governing speech, belief, and loyalty. Under his regime, even a careless word against the crown or church could be met with harsh punishment. The king established a network of local enforcers, known as the Watchers, who reported anyone suspected of blasphemy or spreading seditious ideas. These Watchers were not soldiers, but common citizens who received tax privileges for turning in offenders. The system encouraged betrayal among neighbors and silenced open discussion across villages. Public gatherings were closely monitored. Clergymen were required to include royal decrees in their sermons, and any hesitation or deviation was taken as defiance. Ulric's government claimed these measures preserved peace, but in practice, they suppressed all forms of free thought. The royal court in Dresden became known for its rigid decorum. No one spoke casually before the king. Servants rehearsed greetings to avoid misunderstanding. Ministers who disagreed with royal policies learned to remain silent, knowing Ulric valued obedience over counsel. Quick reminder: if you are enjoying, do like the video and subscribe the channel for more historical torture content. Reports from that era describe Ulric as a ruler who viewed speech itself as a weapon. He believed that rebellion began with words long before it took the form of action. For him, controlling speech was equivalent to maintaining power. The early years of his rule were marked by trials of scholars and merchants accused of spreading false doctrines. Many of them had merely discussed church reforms or criticized taxation. Still, under Ulric's law, verbal dissent carried the same weight as treason. To administer these laws, the king appointed Heinrich Vollmer, a former magistrate, as the chief enforcer of verbal crimes. Vollmer compiled a detailed list of offenses under the category of verbal heresy. The list included blasphemy, perjury, and slander against authority, all punishable by imprisonment, mutilation, or death. The king's approach was supported by his court theologians, who argued that words had divine significance. According to them, a sinful tongue was the root of moral corruption, and silencing it served both justice and faith. This argument provided the moral foundation for the punishments that followed. The royal archives from Dresden record the steady construction of new dungeons and chambers dedicated to verbal correction. These were not general prisons, but specific facilities designed to interrogate those whose speech was deemed dangerous. Every accused person was subjected to questioning intended to extract confessions or retractions. Ulric also created a written decree titled Lex Linguae, the law of the tongue. It outlined procedures for handling those accused of verbal crimes. The law was strict. Anyone found guilty of public blasphemy could face removal of the tongue or lifelong silence through mutilation. Lex Linguae became infamous across neighboring states. Foreign envoys described Saxony as a place where even the birds seemed quiet, as conversations took place only in whispers. The atmosphere of fear spread quickly, discouraging all forms of open dialogue. Despite the growing unease among the populace, Ulric justified his actions as necessary to prevent rebellion. He claimed that leniency toward dissenters in other kingdoms had led to wars and chaos. His methods, he said, would preserve order and obedience. The king's palace housed a collection of instruments used for moral correction. Some were borrowed from existing punitive traditions, while others were designed under royal commission. Among them was a small iron clamp that would later gain notoriety as one of the most effective tools for silencing prisoners, the tongue screw. The earliest records of the tongue screw appear in the journals of Ulric's metallurgist, Otto Greiss. Greiss described the device as an adjustable clamp fitted with a screw mechanism capable of applying gradual pressure to the tongue. Its simplicity made it both easy to construct and effective for interrogation. Initially, the tongue screw was used sparingly, primarily against convicted blasphemers who refused to retract their words. However, over time it became a symbol of Ulric's broader campaign against free expression, Possession of forbidden writings, or even questioning a royal order, could lead to its use. Contemporary observers wrote of the king's fascination with the device's precision. He reportedly regarded it as a humane alternative to mutilation, since it inflicted intense pain without immediate death. This perspective reflected the era's complex views on punishment, where physical suffering was often equated with moral purification. By the final decade of his rule, the tongue screw had become a fixture in the courts of Saxony. Judges ordered its use not only for religious crimes, but for lying under oath and defaming officials. The instrument's application was standardized, and executioners received training on how to control pressure without causing fatal injury. Records from 1587 indicate that Saxony's population had declined due to migration. Merchants and scholars left the duchy for freer regions, citing the unbearable silence and constant fear. Neighboring rulers criticized Ulric's rule, but few intervened, as his methods mirrored a broader European trend toward suppressing dissent. In his final years, King Ulric ruled from isolation within his fortress, surrounded by courtiers too afraid to speak in his presence. Chroniclers noted that he would often sit for hours without a word, as if trapped in the same silence he had imposed upon his people. When Ulric II died in 1592, Saxony's archives listed over 400 cases of verbal crimes punished during his reign. Among them were several detailed descriptions of the tongue screw's use, written by the same officials who once praised its efficiency. Those records would later form the foundation of one of history's most infamous instruments of punishment, a device designed to silence, born under the authority of a king who feared words more than weapons. After King Ulric II's death, his successors maintained many of his legal codes, including Lex Linguae. Although later rulers were less authoritarian, the system of speech control remained deeply embedded within Saxony's judicial practices. The tongue screw, once a tool of royal enforcement, evolved into a recognized method of interrogation across local courts and prisons. The device itself was simple yet methodical in design. It consisted of two small metal plates with a central screw that could be turned gradually to compress the tongue. The more the screw was tightened, the greater the pressure. Pain increased not through sudden injury but through deliberate constriction. The device's construction allowed precise control, making it favored by interrogators who valued endurance over speed. The earliest surviving tongue screws from Saxony were made of iron and measured only a few inches in length. Some were fitted with serrated edges to prevent slipping. The tongue was placed between the plates, and the screw was turned until the subject's speech became slurred or impossible. The process aimed not to kill, but to silence and extract repentance. Records from the Dresden court archives show that cases involving verbal offenses were divided into categories. Minor blasphemy referred to careless or drunken speech against the church or monarch, while major heresy covered deliberate defiance or public criticism. The tongue screw was reserved for the latter category. During interrogation, prisoners were often brought before a magistrate who read aloud the charges. The accused would be given one chance to recant. If they refused, the clerk recorded the refusal, and the interrogator was authorized to proceed. This process ensured that the act was considered lawful, following the written statutes of Lex Linguae. Accounts from court scribes describe the tongue screw being applied in small increments. Interrogators would tighten the screw, wait, and then question the prisoner again. The goal was not confession through agony alone, but moral submission, the point at which the accused acknowledged the authority of the state or church. One of the best documented cases involved a schoolteacher named Andreas Keller, arrested in 1588 for criticizing a sermon that praised the king's decrees. Keller was accused of undermining royal authority and spreading irreverence among youth. Despite repeated questioning, he refused to retract his words. The magistrate ordered the use of the tongue screw as prescribed by law. The official record of Keller's interrogation notes that the device was applied 3 times over the course of 2 days. Each session lasted no more than 15 minutes, but the cumulative effect rendered his tongue swollen and partially damaged. Unable to speak clearly afterward, Keller signed a written confession prepared by the clerk. The record stated that his repentance was complete and sufficient. The tongue screw was also employed in public punishments as a deterrent. In these cases, It was used briefly before large crowds during market days or religious festivals. The condemned would be displayed on a raised platform with the device attached, symbolizing the suppression of lies and blasphemy. Afterward, they were either released with a warning or subjected to further penalties such as branding. By the early 17th century, the device's use spread beyond Saxony into other territories influenced by Germanic law. Theological courts in Austria, Bohemia, and parts of Switzerland adopted similar procedures. Manuals for interrogators included illustrations of the tongue screw alongside other instruments, labeling it as suitable for crimes of speech. The instrument was not limited to religious enforcement. Civil courts used it for perjury and false testimony. Judges argued that by punishing the tongue directly, the device targeted the physical organ responsible for deceit. This rationale reflected a broader medieval belief that moral corruption could be treated through bodily discipline. Not all officials agreed with its use. A memorandum from 1612, written by a Saxon physician named Martin Holz, criticized the tongue screw for causing long-term injury and infection. Holz argued that the device often rendered prisoners unable to eat or speak properly for weeks. His letter suggested that the practice caused more suffering than necessary for correction. Despite such objections, the tongue screw remained in use for more than a century. Its simplicity made it difficult to abolish, as it required no complex mechanism or large equipment. Interrogators could carry it easily and apply it without assistance. As a result, it became a practical tool of control, even in small villages far from central authority. The design also evolved over time. Later versions incorporated locking screws to maintain pressure without continuous turning. Some were engraved with religious symbols such as crosses or Latin inscriptions, reflecting the notion that silence could serve as purification. These details indicate that punishment was viewed not merely as retribution, but as a means to cleanse the soul of sin. Historical inventories list the tongue screw alongside other minor torture devices, like the thumb press and the ear clamp. All served a similar purpose, extracting confessions without immediate fatality. They were classified as corrective instruments, distinguishing them from executions or permanent mutilations. The court system documented each use meticulously. Every interrogation required the presence of 2 witnesses and a clerk to record the degree of pressure applied. These records were preserved to protect interrogators from accusations of cruelty, showing how bureaucratic formality legitimized acts of physical coercion. By the late 1600s, foreign travelers visiting Saxony commented on the continued reliance on such punishments. English writer Edmund Layfield noted in his journal that citizens spoke softly even in private inns, fearing informants. He described the tongue screw as a small iron of great consequence, symbolizing how governance through speech control persisted long after Ulric's death. In later decades, Enlightenment philosophers began to challenge such practices. Thinkers like Christian Thomasius of Leipzig criticized the idea of silencing dissent through physical pain. They argued that truth could not be forced from a suffering body. However, reform was slow to reach the smaller courts, where traditional justice still prevailed. The last known judicial use of the tongue screw in Saxony occurred in 1723, during a heresy trial against a printer accused of circulating unapproved pamphlets. The record shows that the device was used briefly during questioning, after which the accused confessed. The case ended with a fine and exile rather than execution. By the mid-18th century, the device disappeared from active use. It was replaced by written censorship, imprisonment, and public recantation. However, its legacy as an early instrument of state censorship endured. Museums later displayed surviving examples as relics of Europe's transition from physical repression to intellectual control. Through centuries of application, the tongue screw demonstrated how a simple mechanical object could embody a complex ideology, one where silence was equated with obedience and speech with rebellion. In the next stage of its history, as reformers and scholars examined the ethics of torture, the tongue screw became not only a symbol of cruelty, but a case study in how power once sought to control the very act of speaking. By the 18th century, the Enlightenment had begun reshaping European attitudes toward punishment and justice. Philosophers and reformers across the continent questioned the morality of using pain to enforce obedience. In Saxony, these changing ideas slowly reached the courts that had once relied on the tongue screw as a standard method of interrogation. Legal scholars started to argue that speech crimes were best addressed through education and reason rather than coercion. The rise of printing and literacy created new spaces for public debate, making it increasingly difficult for governments to silence every form of dissent. The physical suppression of speech gave way to intellectual control through censorship, where words were restricted on paper instead of through bodily punishment. The Saxon Criminal Code of 1768 formally abolished the use of physical instruments in verbal crimes. Judges were instructed to issue written warnings, monetary fines, or exile rather than physical correction. This reform marked the end of the tongue screw as an active judicial tool, though its memory persisted in legal discussions as a symbol of past severity. Museums and collectors began to preserve surviving examples of the device. One such specimen from Dresden was displayed in the 19th century as part of an exhibition on medieval justice. Visitors often reacted with disbelief at its simplicity and precision, noting that an object so small could cause such lasting harm. Historians emphasize that its cruelty lay not in its appearance, but in its intent to destroy communication itself. The tongue screw's design influenced later discussions on the ethics of interrogation. Early criminologists cited it as an example of how legal systems once confused silence with truth. The assumption that pain could produce honesty became one of the key arguments for abolishing torture in modern law. By the 20th century, the device appeared mainly in academic studies and museum archives. Its image was included in textbooks on European penal history and human rights development. Each reference served as a reminder that the control of speech had once been enforced through physical pain rather than ideological persuasion. In modern times, historians studying the reign of King Ulric II view the tongue screw not only as a tool of repression, but as evidence of how political power sought to regulate thought through the body. It represented an era when governments equated silence with loyalty and dissent with moral corruption. The instrument's endurance for nearly 2 centuries demonstrates how deeply rooted such beliefs were within the structures of authority. Today, the tongue screw stands as a historical artifact rather than a functional instrument. It reminds scholars and visitors alike of a period when speech itself was subject to punishment, and silence was enforced not by law alone, but by fear. Its legacy continues to inform modern discussions on freedom of expression, serving as proof that the most effective way to control ideas once began by crushing the human tongue.